So, how many people on their Facebook feed or whatever social media saw a picture of that spider that he showed? Mine came up on mine. Okay, so I was the only person that had friends who showed it, and I had friends who showed it more than once. And I posted the Snopes article for that. What about people? And this goes to something that Barbara said earlier, that League is suggesting that we don't repeat the misinformation or disinformation when we're trying to combat it. But in the video, for example, John just talked about the issue with the autism issue. And there's no way to combat that particular issue without bringing, I don't know how would you combat it without bringing the controversy up? It seems very difficult to combat that. So what did you guys think of what he had to say? Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, I wasn't trying to say.
Oh, I thought you're unmuting yourself to talk. So.
No. I think you just have to be very careful when you craft a message and not mention the fact that there's this spurious correlation between autism and vaccination. But you just say vaccination has been proven to be safe, period.
The problem with that is that if somebody actually believes the spurious information, you do have to actually go into trying to prove. It depends on how the person comes to the argument, and it depends on how much you want to, how important it is in that particular situation for you to correct that person, how important, whether you have, for example, grandchildren who are going to be harmed by no vaccinations or other people, or whether it's just somebody who on the internet and you're just going to let it go. So you have to make a choice about when to do the arguing as well. Yeah. Any other comments about what John had to say?
Well,
Liz, go ahead.
Just with what you were just saying, I mean, finding a good link to a deeper article that goes back to the fact that the original article was retracted, blah, 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 rather than recapitulating all of that information there, so you could say something simple like, actually, that belief is based on fraud. Here's a link if you want to read more. Might be an intermediate place.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think one of the things that he says early on, which I think is important, is, does the information make sense, or is your brain just trying to make sense? So you're scrolling on your feed and stuff, and you're going along, and it's going, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Oh, does it really make sense? So you actually have to stop reading and then go out and do some analysis, or go out and do some lateral reading. The other thing is that if I'm reading something and boy, it's really confirming something that I believe, oh yes, I'm going to be less likely to go check it. And so that's a clue that maybe, oops, I might need to go check on that. So I thought those were good points as well. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is that at the University of Washington, there are two professors who were in the School of Information Management. They're two scientists who created a class, I think in 2014, but it might be a year later, called Calling Bullshit. And we're going to go look that. And the class got filled up completely. And there's now a book. I have the book. It's a wonderful read. You can view the class online. You can take all of it for free. And they have now created called the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. And it's a multidisciplinary research center in Seattle that has this mission: to resist strategic misinformation, promote an informed society, and strengthen democratic discourse. And it's four things: research, education, engagement, law, and policy. And this is a collaboration between three parts of the University of Washington: the Information School, the School of Law, and actually the department that I got my master's degree from, the Human Centered Design and Engineering department in the Engineering College. And they have some very prestigious funders. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation gave a donation of $50 million to start this particular thing. And they are also significant contributions from many people, but including the Hewlett Foundation, Microsoft, National Science Foundation. So they're putting some serious dollars and cents behind this idea. And so I'm pointing it out, and we're going to take a look at some information from this thing. But one of the things that they start with is back, I believe it's about 12 years ago, an Italian named Brandolini coined the bullshit principle, which is the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. So, and this is refining on another Italian's definition that was a little earlier. But the idea is that when they're talking in the book or in their courses about bullshit, it's like there's two different ways. There's either a lie and you're surrounding it with a lot of other things that look like evidence, or it's a truth, but the evidence that you're providing is invalid. And so either of those is true. And they go into detail in the book and in the course about this. But I think one of the things that's most amusing to look at least initially, is the whole issue of correlations. So there's a whole website called Spurious Correlations, and we're going to go look at it because I think one of the things that's interesting is some of the ones that they've found. So let's go to that website, and hopefully you will be able to see some of them, but some of them are pretty interesting. For example, US spending on space, science, and technology, and suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. The line is the same, but there is no evidence to show that they're together. This is the Nicolas Cage example from the website. The number of people who died become entangling with their bed sheets, and the per capita cheese consumption. And these are all things that have been used as evidence. The divorce rate in Maine at the per capita consumption of margarine. Let's see, there's a couple down here. Let's see. People who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat, and the marriage rate in Kentucky. So as you can see, there's many places, and this website collects those. So I thought that you'd think that that was somewhat interesting. And those collection has actually become a book called Spurious Correlations. And I think one of the things, if we're talking about, let's talk about the kind of information that we often do in League, and how misinformation and disinformation can be manipulated around voting and how you vote, where you vote. And we have some great examples that are in the news right now. For example, in Georgia, it looks like the Georgia legislature is getting prepared to institute a bill that will seriously disenfranchise and suppress the vote. And there's a lot of information around that, and yet all of the data doesn't. How do we do that? So this is one of those places where we're talking about evidence, but I want to have a discussion, a little bit of a discussion about how do we, understanding that for people who understand that how we vote in Washington, but we have people from other states here. What, for example, Barbara, are you facing in Alabama? Is that right? With regard to voter suppression, and what kind of facts do you have to deal with?
Well, we, of course, hear a constant chorus of voter fraud. Anything having to do with any form of voting other than going in person on election day, showing your voter ID and casting a paper ballot in person. Any other kind of voting is described as having a potential for voter fraud. And we're in the legislature right now where there's bills that would prohibit any attempt to modify voting. For instance, I think our no excuse absentee voting bills are pretty much dead. We have bills that would prohibit curbside voting, which would benefit people that are physically handicapped. That's prohibited. It's just, it's depressing is what it is. But the thing is voter fraud, that's the mantra. And of course, like all the other Republican secretaries of state, ours is pushing the narrative of easy to vote, hard to cheat. And we actually have contemplated reversing it and saying hard to vote, easy to cheat, even though that's not true. But framing a narrative in that circumstance is very difficult because nobody is in favor of voter fraud.
So in our state, we have a Republican Secretary of State who is extremely positive with regard to easy access to the ballot box. And we've demonstrated in Washington state that our voter fraud rates are very low and we have very easy ways of voting here. And so, and the Oregon Republican is Secretary of State is also Republican and also is in that camp. So,
Right,
so
and
I
I
guess
didn't mean to cast aspersions on every Republican Secretary of State, but
okay.
it is the Republican Secretaries of State that pushed voter ID laws and followed a path to restrict access to the ballot box. Many of them have.
So yeah, some of them have. But I think a lot of that originated in legislatures and then they had to administer a law that was very difficult. But you're right. I'm not disagreeing that there are secretaries of state who did that. But so if we were looking at this from an evidence perspective, and then this is a little bit outside the scope of the crash course video for today, but it's important. So if voter fraud, what is the definition of voter fraud? Would that be a way to attack that argument? So I'm trying to think of a way of us creating evidence that could be reasonable and understandable in order to convince people to ask their legislators not to vote for that or to vote for bills that would improve voter access. How do we counteract the narrative about voter fraud? Go ahead, Ann.
I don't know that this directly answers your question, but I'm just kind of reflecting that a lot of what came up in this conversation was with this particular election. And we, of course, in Washington and Oregon have been doing it this way for years. I mean, we're so very accustomed to it, and it was put in, in Washington in a very thoughtful manner. First, there were a couple counties, and then it finally went statewide, that kind of thing. But with what happened in so many of the states, they were thrown into this because of the conditions, the pandemic conditions and that kind of thing this last year, that it probably all seemed so very rushed to people, and they don't have a way to, it's like running a pilot program and you prove it works and then you expand it, and they just didn't have that opportunity. So then they can wind up being convinced that there is fraud for whatever reason they think it's fraud.